So this is day 3. It's going to be a very, very full day. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So yesterday, when we were doing conceptualization and operationalization, our Zoom team had a presentation that they wanted to make that we didn't get around to. So we're going to start with that. Then we asked at the end of the day what research methods you might be interested in using for your research proposals. So I'll present the results of that word cloud. And I used that to get up very early this morning at 5 o'clock and prepare overviews of the kinds of methods that you are interested in. So I'm going to give you that overview. Then, oh, I put the tea break in at the wrong time. I apologize. That should be 10:30 to 11, not 11 to 11:30. 11 to 11:30 is going to be Brent and Bill. They are going to come back and they are going to provide an overview of the call for proposals. I've seen it. It should answer all of your questions. I just reviewed it early this morning. And please, please, please do take this time to ask any questions that you have. I may also ask them some questions on your behalf. And whatever time we don't use for that, we'll continue with our research methods. Then we'll do our break. Then I will spend some time looking at specific research methods, ones that you've identified you're interested in. And then you'll work in your table groups. Again, I'm just smiling because the kitty cat just came in the door. Tara and I love kitty cats. And then we'll have our tea break. And then the last area that I will cover is populations and sampling. How do we draw a sample, whether you're sampling trees or people or communities? And then at the end of the day will be a wrap up and review. Any questions about that as we move forward? Okay, next slide. Way back. Okay. Actually, let's leave it on this slide. So we're going to stay on conceptualization and operationalization for just a few minutes before we move to choice of research method. And can we go to the Zoom group?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to online participants. This is our result of discussion about conceptualization and operationalization. We have several definition about mangrove. General definition: mangroves are salt-tolerant trees and shrubs that grow in interdal of tropical and subtropical coastline, and they have adapted to survive in saline water and contribute significantly to coastal ecosystem. And the ecological definition: mangrove ecosystems are characterized by the presence of salt-tolerant plant community adapted to interdal environments, playing crucial roles in coastal protection, biodiversity conservation, and carbon cycling. And then the functional definition: mangrove are coastal ecosystems that provide a wide range of essential functions, including coastal protection, nursery grounds for fish and shellfish, water filtration, and carbon sequestration. And then protected area. Protected area is a clearly defined geographical space recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural value. This definition comes from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, widely recognized as the global standard of protected areas. And from an ecological perspective, protected area are decided space set aside to conserve biodiversity, ecological process, and natural landscape. They play a crucial role in protecting endangered species, maintaining ecosystem health, and providing important habitat for wildlife. From a social perspective, protected areas are safeguard cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and the livelihood of local communities who depends on them. And from a legal perspective, protected areas are established through legal framework that define their boundaries, management objective, and regulation. And local livelihood. Local livelihood means by which individuals and communities living in a space area meet their basic needs and improve their well-being. This includes access to food, water, shelter, income, healthcare, education, and other essential resources. The key characteristic of local livelihood: place-based, resources depends, and social and cultural context and sustainability. Maybe that's all our presentation.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think it's brilliant. I love your operational definition of mangrove protected areas. Can you put that slide back up for just a second? Yes. So I would say just two things about this operational definition. I like it a lot. But I just want to point out that we had a discussion yesterday about legal versus non-legal, legally defined protected areas, that some are defined by the community and not the state. And so in this definition, we see that it could be another way, right? So this is yesterday, remember when I was talking about contested constructs? What do we mean when we say vulnerable? We know that there are vulnerable populations, but some people don't like to be called vulnerable. It's contested. And here we're seeing contested as well. Is it legally mandated or can it be community mandated? Maybe it's better if it's community mandated because the community should be in charge. So I really, really like that you pointed those two things out. Where it gets tricky is that in this operational definition, we include phrases like ecosystem services and cultural values. So there are two new terms that we have to define. But I think you've done an absolutely brilliant job. Really, really well done. Yay. Another round of applause for our Zoom group. Can we go back to the slides, please? Okay. You may find this hard to believe, but this gets me so excited to go through this research process and start with a problem and then get really into the specifics of how we can solve that problem. Can you just go back for just one sec, my friend? Well, I guess I can do that, can't I? Ha, ha, ha. Whoop. I have so much control. Okay, so we started with a problem. We developed some really strong research questions. We know how to use the literature to what I would call solidify our gap. We think there's a gap. Let's go to the literature, confirm that, so that when we're writing our proposals, we don't just say there's a gap. We don't just tell you. We show you. There is a gap, and here's a reference from the literature, the evidence for this gap, whether that's literature or a report or other data. And then we went through a long day yesterday of conceptualization and operationalization. It's challenging, but so important. And we just quickly reviewed your feedback from yesterday. and got such positive feedback about how much you learned about that process. And I'm smiling because those data are anonymous. So I'm going to take them back to Canada, show my students how much you liked learning that, because they complain about it all the time. But then we need to figure out, oh, this way, how are we going to collect the data that's going to answer our research question? What method are we going to use to get data? Okay. So we asked you yesterday what kinds of methods you might use. So I just want to point out a few things from here. Using both quantitative and qualitative. And as you know, the larger the word, the more frequently it was put forward. I want you to think very carefully about using both types of methods for this particular proposal, because you have 12 months. And if you're doing quantitative and qualitative, you have to design the research tools, test the research tools, administer the research tools, clean the data, analyze the data. Tara's excited about the kitty. And I'll just share with you, you saw my PhD dissertation yesterday. It took me 12 months to design my survey from beginning to end. 12 months just to design the survey. So unless you're going to, for example, go to the literature, find a survey that's already been used and validated, it's a lot of work. And so I would just encourage you to think very carefully about using both types of methods in this short time that we have, or that you have, okay? I also want to point out that one of the largest responses was a systematic literature review. I just want you to think very carefully about how that applies in the context of an applied research project. All right, so what are you going to learn from a systematic review that can be applied? It is not impossible at all. In fact, about 15 years ago, I wrote a paper called The Knowledge Journey. And in that, I talk about the importance of knowledge creation, so actually doing original research, but also knowledge synthesis. And that's taking knowledge that already exists, but it's fractured, it's in different places, in different forms. And if you can synthesize that into a single entity, that could be useful for policymakers or communities. A systematic review is an example of that. But just remember, it must be applied, okay? Oh, sorry, I just noticed this one here, qualitative research strengthened by quantitative. So again, lots of people thinking what I call mixed methods, quant and qual. So think about the time that you have. Some of the methods I see are more related to sampling, which we're going to talk about at length today. So purposive sampling, snowball sampling, and then other methods very specific. Interview, FGD, which stands for focus group discussion, questionnaire. So we are going to go through all of those today. It's a lot of material. And not everything is going to be relevant to everyone because you're going to be using different types of methods. But you will have copies of all of the slides that you can keep for reference in case you use a different method in the future, or in case once you sit down to start writing up your research proposal, you choose a different method and you can go back to the slides and they'll help you. Okay, so we're going to jump right in. We haven't heard from the Zoom folks yet, right? Just double check that before we move to a different thing. Nope. Okay. So off we go to learn about all different kinds of research methods. A basic distinction between quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative research uses numbers, statistics in the collection and analysis of data. Qualitative research does not. Qualitative researchers use words and other non-numeric symbols. What does that mean? Sometimes, for example, we use photographs. So instead of doing an interview with someone about what does the mangrove mean to you and asking them questions and recording their answers, we actually ask them to take photographs of what the mangrove means to you, and we analyze the photographs. In one paper that we published, we were studying children with a chronic illness. And we wanted to understand how having this illness made the children feel. So instead of asking the children, how does it make you feel? Because it's hard for children to articulate big feelings, we asked them to draw us a picture of how the illness made them feel. And we analyzed their drawings. So there's lots of interesting things that you can do. What does it look like? What does it sound like? On the left-hand side is an example of a questionnaire that we actually used in a large sample. And you can see boxes that you tick off, things that you circle, numbers that you report. A lot of questions in a small space. And people go through, tick the boxes, circle the things, give you a number. It's very quick. It's very superficial, extensive, very superficial. Because it's very quick, we can do a lot of them in a short period of time. So our sample sizes are very large. On the right-hand side, yes, right-hand side, is an example of a data collection tool used when we do interviews, not questionnaires. Same population, different research question. Answering all these questions tells us what. Answering these questions tells us how and why. So we ask a question. I have to get closer so I can see. Let's start. Oh, introduce yourself. Oh, sorry. These are questions in a different population. I apologize. This is for children in low to middle income countries who are experiencing violence. And we start by asking them about themselves, questions like, who looks after you at home? Who makes your meals? Who helps you with homework? Who helps you get ready for school? These are the questions. They're very open-ended. We record the words of the children, literally digitally record them with a digital recorder. And if they're shy and don't want to answer us, we use these probes over here. So we want the children to tell us about themselves. So we ask them, what grade are you in school? What's your favorite subject in school? What activities do you like to do when you're not in school? Children are very shy, and in these cultures, they're very deferential to adults. So they might shrug their shoulders. How many times have you asked a child a question and they just go, not very useful for qualitative research? So we have a little probe. Do you play any sports? Do you sing in a choir? Tell me about that. Get them talking. So very, very different structure. It looks very different and it sounds very different. And when we record these data, we're just recording numbers. When we record these data, we're recording conversations. So, fundamental differences between these two. Our theory is theory testing and quantitative. Our colleague who's going to look at species of trees knows a priori or in advance from the literature, from theory, what are the best trees to grow in this soil. I'm going to test that theory by planting those trees in this soil to see if it works. Oh, sorry. Whereas qualitative is more inductive. We're going to explore, we're going to find out. Quantitative is much more prevalent in natural science than the qualitative is more interpretive. We want to interpret how people feel. We're much more objective here, much more constructive here. So for example, I could give somebody a risk perception scale. What's your perceived risk around climate change? They could fill it out and I could get a number. That would be very quantitative. Or I could interview them and ask them, how do you feel about climate change? What worries you about climate change? They construct that perception of risk in the context of who they are as a person, what their other roles in society are. Are they a parent? Are they a farmer? Are they a policymaker? They construct that reality. Okay, those are the fundamental differences. When do we use these? How do we decide which way to go? When there's been very little research done, we typically turn to qualitative research. So the researchers who said in the word cloud, qualitative and quantitative, I would guess they want to do some qualitative stuff first to find out what people are thinking because they don't really know. That's a time when we would choose qualitative, when little or no research has been done. Secondly, when a researcher wants to study individuals involved in illicit activities. So I heard that sometimes there are individuals in the mangrove communities who maybe cut down trees illegally and sell them on the black market. Yeah. So if we want to talk to those people, emailing them a questionnaire is probably not the best thing to do. We need to build a rapport with them, just like our researchers were trying to build a rapport with the children who experienced violence. If I don't build a rapport with those children, they're not going to tell me anything, and I'm not going to be able to answer my research question. If you don't build a rapport with people who are engaged in perhaps illegal activities, they're not going to tell you anything, and you're not going to be able to answer your research question. So just back to reiterating where research questions come from, because as I said, the more we learn through this process, the more likely it is we might revise the research questions that we've already developed. So, is it a brand new phenomenon? Is it something that's never been studied before? Are you measuring impact? Are you measuring people's perceptions of things or worlds? Are you testing hypotheses? These are questions you can ask yourself or your research team, and that will help you decide what your research question will look like. This is a paper that I published in 1999, long time ago, that Tara referred to yesterday, which is, and the question shall determine the method. And on day one, when I said, once we've got our research questions sorted, everything else will fall into place. You have a research question that has the words how in it. How do women participate in mangrove restoration, for example? That might lead us to qualitative. A question like what percentage of the local population contributes to mangrove restoration? It's a what question. Sounds like a quantitative question. So how we phrase our research questions can lead us in the direction of the research method that we will choose. So remember, the choice of the research method has to match your question. And a research question states the purpose of the study in the form of a question. For example, what environmental or economic or demographic factors influence the choice of livelihoods in rural Indonesia? How do we measure community resilience to climate change? What role can women play in mangrove restoration to achieve ecosystem sustainability? So purpose is explicit in the question, not implicit, explicit, clearly stated, and it's in the form of a question. The form of the question will be shaped by whether or not you're going the qualitative route or the quantitative route. That's because when we do qualitative research, it's often because we don't know what's happening. So we are there to explore to explore, for example, perceptions of women's roles in mangrove management. To understand the implications of gender for ecosystem sustainability. It's more inductive. That is, we start with the data, we start with the voices of our respondents. And we typically do not have a priori hypotheses or hypotheses in our head before we start. We don't know what direction this is going to go. So we can't say we're going to test the hypothesis that women's involvement in mangrove restoration is more important than men's involvement in mangrove restoration, because we don't know. Alternatively, when we're using quantitative, we are setting out to test causal models. We start to talk about cause and effect. This variable affects this variable, and we can test that. It's more deductive. And we narrow down our research questions to make those more testable hypotheses. For example, which restoration method is more effective? Method A or method B? Which tree species is more effective in contributing to resilience of the mangrove areas? Tree A, tree B, tree C. You saw this on day one, and this is just a reminder. Back to your research questions. They have to be clear. Clarity is key. They have to include all the words, because Brent's not going to be able to read your mind, especially if you write it in Bahasa. They have to be researchable. Are there data out there that are going to allow you to answer this question, or are there data accessible to you? Are there ways of getting those data so that you can answer that question or those questions? Can you relate your research question to established theory and or research, right? Going to the literature and saying, in this part of Indonesia, they did this. I'm going to test it in this part of Indonesia. Those research questions have to be linked or closely related to each other. And we talked about that yesterday. I saw so many wonderful examples of research question A led into research question B, led into research question C. It was fabulous. They should allow us as researchers to make a contribution to existing knowledge. That's our job, to push forth the frontiers of knowledge. And this is the crazy one that's hard to understand. It can't be too broad and it can't be too narrow. So how do you know it's right? Right? And that's where we use each other. We use our research teams. We draw on the literature. We talk to each other and we say, what do you think of this research question? You know what? I just had this thought before I get to that next slide. You now have, I don't know if you use this phrase here. Does anybody use the phrase community of practice? Anybody use that phrase? You now have a community of practice in this room and on Zoom. You all know each other now, and you're all experts in how to write a research proposal. Use that. So when you're writing your letters of intent, send them to each other. Say, can you read this for me? Does it make sense to you? And sometimes it's best to have someone who's not in your area read it. And they can be really honest because they've been through this training and say, this does not make sense to me. I don't know what you're talking about. Or I don't know what this word means, or I don't know how you're going to do this. So use each other in the nicest sense of that word. Exploit each other. Rely on each other. Okay. Using Tara's wonderful, I've learned so much from Tara on this trip. Using Tara's wonderful phrase, I'm going to stop now. Is there anything we can clarify for you before we move on to study designs? Yes, sir. One at the back and then at the middle table, Tara.
Thank you. Thank you, Elliot, for this is a really good thing and new for me. Um, I just want to clarify. Is there any? I don't know, sorry. Could you elaborate more about the ethical issues when we, for example, like doing the qualitative research? For example, like is it mandatory to asking for permissions to the people who we want to be to interview? I mean, like, is there any penalty that we will get if we don't asking for permissions to record the interviews after that? And thank you.
Yeah, actually, that's a very, very good question and something that I neglected to ask Brent about. So I'm going to bring it up today and I'm just going to write this down. In my world, at my university, I am not allowed to speak to another human being and ask them research questions until I have approval from my research ethics board at my university, right? Lid up. So great question. I don't know how long that takes here. I know in my university, it's about 8 to 10 weeks. So that can really cut into the time that you have for your research if you have to get ethics approval. Also, in the countries within which I work, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Ghana, I not only have to get ethics approval from my university, but if I want to talk to people in Kenya, I have to do that first. And then I have to go to a local university in Kenya, get their approval. They charge $1,000 for that. And then I have to go to the country level, the National Ethics Board. That's like 6 months. So there's half your research proposal. So I want to come back and ask Asmi, maybe she knows the answer to this question, because I know NGOs do not have to get ethics approval from a university in my world, or companies don't have to get ethics approval, but a university researcher does. So is that the case at ITB? And how long does that process take? And is there also a country level ethics?
I heard about this from Ibu Meti. Ibu Meti, can you explore about that? I think in IPB has the
Yeah, in ABB, we have ethic commission that we can apply. So we can send some fulfill the formula and then send our questionnaire to them, and they will be ask something related to the ethic, and after that we can get the ethic from the ethics commission.
Does it cost money? And how
Yeah,
long does
cost
it
money, but I don't remember the cost. I think it is not so expensive.
Okay. How long does it take?
About 2 weeks, I think.
Only 2 weeks?
Yeah,
Okay. That's really
but
fast.
we have to make it sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
because
And then is there a national level approval, did you say as well?
perhaps I'm not sure, but for example, if we want to send our article to the some journal, sometimes they ask for the ethic.
Yes.
It's work when we get the ethic from our university.
Okay, perfect. Because I was also going to say, if you're an NGO, you don't have to get ethics approval, but if you want to publish your work in an international journal, you must have ethics approval, right? So I am the editor-in-chief of 2 journals. One is called Social Science and Medicine, and the other is called Wellbeing, Space, and Society. I will not accept any papers that have no ethics approval. And I have a former PhD student right now who got a paper accepted in a journal We have ethics approval from the University of Waterloo, but his research was in Ghana and he did not, although he is Ghanaian, he did not get ethics approval from the country of Ghana, so they will not publish his paper. So build that into your timelines if you're going to actually talk to human beings. But what I also want to say is there are other ways to get data where you don't have to talk to people. And we'll go through that, but let me just give you a couple of examples. One of my graduate students wanted to understand the impacts of heat-related climate change on university students who live on the campus. She only had 1 year to do her research. We did not have time to apply for ethics in my university. It would have taken up 6 to 8 weeks of that. We didn't have time. So she had to look for another source of data. So she went to social media, which made really good sense. Young people, when they have issues, they put it on the social media, and we used, I don't know, is Reddit global? Yeah, okay. She analyzed Reddit posts of students saying, it is so hot in here, I can't study, my grades are falling, I can't sleep at night, I'm fighting with my roommate all the time, I feel sick, I have headaches. It was amazing. And her paper was just published in a journal. And she did not, because any social media posts that are in the public domain, you do not need ethics approval to use those and analyze them. One of the projects we're doing right now is we are analyzing Google Trends. So you can actually go in, they call it scraping. You can go in and scrape Google searches. So I'm making things up here, but if you have farmers who are actually searching Google for climate change or mangrove restoration or anything like that, you can go in and analyze those searches. And you don't need ethics approval to do that because it's in the public domain. It's really, really cool. We are actually doing that in the context of another project because this project that we do of women with lupus, there are advocacy organizations that support them, that are there for, like, if you get diagnosed with this terrible disease and you need help, you're supposed to go to the advocacy organization that will help you and give you information. Nobody's doing it. We can't figure out why. So we're going to go to Google because we know what happens if you have a headache or if you have a pain in your leg. You go to Google, right? And you search it. So we're going to go and find all the searches that are related to this disease and analyze those and say to the advocacy organizations, well, you're providing information about X, but they really want to find out about Y. So there are sources of information that you can use that you don't need ethics for in the qualitative sense. But I'm going to leave this up so when Brent and Bill are here, we actually ask that question because it can really slow down your research process unless there are other things you can be doing while you're waiting for your ethics approval, like searching the literature or whatever. Okay, there's a question at this table, the lady in the beautiful headscarf. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. I was actually just gonna ask a same question. So, right now I got a problem about the ethical committee for interview. Yeah, my paper I have submitted to the biodiversity and conservation, and they asked the ethical standard committee, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I didn't make it on that time because the university that I'm working on that time, they didn't require any kind of this thing. And right now I'm still postpone my submission. And yeah, do you have any idea about this? And then, because I had an experience another from regional studies, marine science, I think, like, I did also interview a whole Indonesian, and then they just accept my paper without any kind of this ethical committee. So I was wondering if actually different journal, they're gonna have a different requirement or something. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So first of all, journals are getting more strict over time. So you might have got a paper accepted in the past and then they've changed their policy. Second of all, you cannot do ethics retroactively, which is really sad. You can't go back and do it, but there are options. And this is just from my own personal experience, but does your paper have anything to do with water? No. Okay. No, there's a water journal that I know that will make an exception if there's a paper from a country where ethics was not required. The other option, because you want to get your work published, the other option, what we have now are preprint sites. Have you heard of preprint sites? Yeah. So there are some really reputable preprint sites that you can post your paper on. You still get a DOI for your paper. People can still reference it and reference it by the DOI. But I would say at this point, if you do not have ethics approval, it's going to be a real struggle to get it into a journal, but you could get it on a preprint site.
Why it is required? Because we only extract the knowledge of the fishermen, like the knowledge about the species condition. Like example, are you seeing this species stranded in this particular beach like that? So the question is only like that simple, and we don't need any ethical. Yeah. But
Yeah.
we still like they
If
require
that's
us.
what the journal says, that's what the journal says. You could try another journal, but every journal will have its instructions right on the website. The only thing would be that you would have to, if you've got that paper in that journal under review, you would have to withdraw it before you submit it somewhere else, because if you don't, it's an issue of academic integrity. So those would be my two suggestions, looking at similar journals and looking at their guides for authors to see. And if you can't find one, put it on a preprint site so that it's out there, people can reference it, it's got a DOI, and move on and just make sure you get ethics approval for everything. That's what I do. The first thing I always do is I go and talk to my director of ethics. Do I need ethics approval to do this? Yes, you do. Okay, whatever you say.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Other questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Are the Zoom people ready? Okay. We'll take a question here and then questions from Zoom. Oh, you want to say it out loud?
Dari peserta yang di Zoom, apakah ada pertanyaan? Kalau ada pertanyaan, silahkan raise hand. Apakah ada pertanyaan?
Tidak ada, Mbak.
Oke, baik. No. Oh ya, oke. Let me. Untuk peserta yang di Zoom tadi Pak Rahmat, Pak Ibu Andita yang mau presentasi, setelah satu pertanyaan dari ruangan, mohon bersiap untuk presentasi ya.
Oke.
Ya, Mbak Andita, silakan Mbak.
Miscommunication.
Saya ya, Pak.
Setelah Bu
Oke,
Andita,
Pak.
mohon maaf, setelah satu pertanyaan dari ruangan baru presentasi ya, Bu ya.
Okay.
Oke, Mbak Azmi.
Okay, can I ask something? Okay. It is interesting that you mentioned about the collect data from the social media. Okay, so what kind methods to collect data from the social media? Do you use perhaps content analysis or something? Could you?
Yeah, we will be talking about methods for qualitative a little bit later, but yes. So I always say it depends on the size of your data set. You can do really good content analysis using, for example, Word. You can do searches, counts, how many. So in my other student's project, which was her undergraduate project, Yuki is her name. And Yuki would just search for words like heat, illness, hot, sweating, anything to do with that. So you can do that, but it wasn't a really large data set. If you want to use a qualitative analysis software package like NVivo, which I will talk about this afternoon, you can use that. So you just capture all of the social media posts, put them into a Word document, upload them into this qualitative analysis software package, and then you can analyze them using this software package. And I'll talk about that this afternoon. I forgot actually in response to your question too. We often do policy analyses where I had a student, for example, we were very interested in local, regional, national, and international policies in countries in sub-Saharan Africa that addressed gender-based violence in the context of water security. So he collected all those documents, like from UNICEF, WHO, UNDP, UNEP, governments of countries, regions, NGO strategic plans, everything. And then you can take those electronic versions of those policy documents and do a content analysis on them. Another way of doing qualitative analysis that does not require ethics approval because those documents are in the public domain. Something to think about. So many different study designs, and it all depends on the question that you're asking, right? So we're going to talk about experimental designs, cross-sectional designs, longitudinal designs, case study designs, and how we move forward. I have the thing. Where did it go? Oh, I know where I put it. I put it on the ledge over here so I could write ethics down. All a research design is a framework for the collection and analysis of the data. I need to know where am I going to get the data from and how am I going to get it? So in order to figure that out, what do I want to learn? What is my research question or questions? What kind of explanation will I want? And we use language like nomothetic. Oh, sorry. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Nomothetic and ideographic. Nomothetic is just a fancy Greek word to describe the scientific method, right? You have testable hypotheses, you run an experiment, you get data, you accept or reject the null hypothesis. This is how we do research in basic science. Ideographic is more so anything that's not the nomothetic method, because we're not testing hypotheses. Nomothetic, our explanations involve attributions of cause and effect, and they're expressed in terms of general laws and principles. Classic examples, the law of gravity. If I drop Tara's clicker on this floor again, it's going to break because this floor is very hard. And because of the law of gravity, if I let go, it's going to go straight down. It's a general law of behavior. We use nomothetic methods. Typically, they're quantitative, and we use them in basic science. We can't really have generalizable laws of human behavior. So if I'm doing research in a community that has a mangrove protected area, and I want to understand the contributions of men and women to that protected area, I can begin to understand them, but I cannot develop a generalizable law that says, thou art a woman, and therefore, in 100% of cases, you will behave this way. Thou art a man, and in 100% of cases, thou wilt behave this way. But I know in 100% of cases, if I let go of this clicker, it will fall to the floor. It's a physical law. So it's a relationship of cause and effect. I let go, it falls. I can understand if you are a woman and you have children, you are more likely to be concerned about the environment. I know this from the literature and studies I've done myself. Women with children are more concerned about the environment than men and women without children. Intuitively, that makes sense. Once you become a mom, you worry about your children constantly, always. My children are almost 40 years old. I still worry about them every day. Where are you? Are you home safe? Are you on an airplane? Did someone pick you up at the airport? All these things. But it doesn't mean every woman with children cares about the environment. I can talk about association or a relationship, but not cause and effect. Whereas our basic scientists can do that. So they talk about satisfying these criteria of association or causation. Things are correlated statistically. We know when we read all those papers and they say, oh, this relationship is statistically significant at 0.05. Who decided 0.05 was the level? Some guy in statistics many years ago. Why did he choose 0.05? I don't know. Had to choose something. But that's the one we use. Time order is very important. So we know smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer. But to understand that causative effect, cause and effect, you have to smoke cigarettes before you get the lung cancer. You can't do it afterwards. Makes no sense. So they have to be time dependent. We can't do that if we're trying to understand, for example, who's more likely to care about the mangrove, men or women, because we don't know. Did they care before they learned about the mangrove, or did they care after? We can't figure that out. And the last Greek word, because all mathematical words are Greek, is non-spuriousness. All that means is we can't, that it's a consistent relationship. It will happen over and over and over and over. It's not spurious. It's not just like a one-off. And there's very likely not a third variable in this mix that's explaining the relationship. It's not due to chance, is all that means. It's actually due to a law, cause and effect. If you're not a basic scientist, we're going to look at a rich description of a person or a group to try and understand things. So who cares more about preserving or restoring the mangrove, men or women? We have to ask them a bunch of questions. We could do a survey. We could do focus groups, ask them to take pictures. So it's more qualitative. It still can be quantitative. If we're doing a survey, we can still do quantitative analysis. I do that all the time. But we can't generalize beyond the people that we talk to. If we're using the nomothetic method, according to the laws of inferential statistics, we have the right to generalize to the population from the sample if it was drawn randomly. So if I talk to, I always think this is funny. Right now in the United States, big presidential elections coming, right? Funny little side story. Whenever this happens, there is a website for Americans who want to move to Canada. And when the election looks bad, the website crashes. Because all the Americans are like, that's it. I'm leaving. I'm going to Canada. So there's a lot of that going on right now. But when they do national surveys to understand, to predict, right, who's going to win the election, and they're always so accurate, except the first time Trump won, and there's a big explanation for that. When they want to find out, you know, they call people up on the phone and they say, if you were going to vote for a president tomorrow, would you vote for Biden or Trump? And they're very accurate. But they can't call every voting age person in the United States of America. Their population's like 300 million or some ridiculous thing. So they take a sample. The sample's only 1,000 people out of 300 million. And they can be really accurate because they use the laws of inferential statistics to draw a specific random sample. We cannot do that if we're talking to women and men in a particular community or set of communities. We can't generalize beyond them because we're not using nomothetic methods. We're not drawing a random sample, and we're going to talk a lot about that at the end of the day. We're trying to understand from an empathetic perspective. And so we talk about not generalizability, but transferability. So if we learn a lot about a community over here in rural Indonesia, and there's another community 20 kilometers away, maybe we can take some of the stuff that we learned here and transfer it there. Not generalize it, but take some of those learnings and transfer them. Once you decide quantitative, qualitative, whatever, we need to choose a specific method to collect the data. Are we going to do a questionnaire? Are we going to do a structured interview? Are we going to do participant observation? And that's where you would maybe, where's my ethnographer? I don't think she's here today. Ethnography is where you go and live in the community and watch and see how they do things. Maybe if you ask them questions, oh yes, we're very committed to maintaining and preserving the mangrove and we do all these things. But if you go and live there and watch them, it's like, no, I don't think you're doing those things. And that's what ethnography is, or experiments. We can do actually experiments as social scientists, but more so this is for the basic scientists. So we're going to go through each of these research designs. Experimental design, and this is primarily aimed at the basic scientists, and you know how to do experiments. I don't need to tell you that. But we can take aspects of this and apply it to our social scientists as well. When we do apply it to our social scientists, we have to be careful because many of the variables of interest to us are not subject to experimental manipulation. So for example, if I'm a tree scientist and I say, okay, I'm going to plant these trees here and these trees here and see which ones grow better, I can't manipulate that variable as well if I want to say, okay, you're going to be a woman, you're going to be a man, regardless of who you are, and I'm going to see how you behave now. Not going to work so much. Ethical concerns preclude performing certain experiments. So if we want to understand, for example, the impact of poverty, if people with lower levels of income are less likely to contribute to mangrove restoration because they're really poor and they need to feed their families, we can't go into a community and say, okay, you 5 people, you're going to be the poor people. We're going to take away all your money and all your stuff. And you people are going to be the rich people. And we're going to give you a whole bunch more stuff and a whole bunch more money. Let's see how you behave. That's very unethical. We can't do that. Many of the things that we're trying to study have long-term complex causes that can't be simulated in experiments. So for example, when I was in church the other day, the minister was talking about children and families, and he presented this research in church that said the number one influence on your children's behavior is you as a parent. So whether or not you are committed to mangrove restoration probably came from the way that your parents behaved, or your peer group behaved, or what you learned in school. And we can't create that in an experiment. And even where we can, experimental models don't get at perceptions and feelings of research participants. And you'll see there that I actually crossed out a word because in most research language, we refer to the people that we're working with as subjects. It's a word that makes me feel uncomfortable because it creates a relationship of power between me and the person in my sample. I don't want to have a power relationship. I want to have an equal relationship because they have knowledge. They're the knowledge owners and I want to get it out of them. So I refer to them as research participants. Two kinds of experiments, experiments in the field and lab experiments. One of the things I love about being in the Department of Geography is that the person in the office beside me is a field person. And that person goes out into the field, especially one of my good friends, Maria Strack, who studies peatlands in Canada. And she's very famous for the work that she does. And, you know, they go out in the field and they measure stuff and it's really cool. Or we can do experiments in the lab, right? If we want to, for example, again, making things up here. I'm not sure if this is happening, but is anyone working in a lab on creating mangrove trees that are more resilient to floods or droughts from a phenotype or genetic perspective? Are there any experiments happening in labs about creating mangrove trees that are more resilient to flood or more resilient to climate change? Yeah, so genetic modifications of.
Yeah, actually, first we can also do RNA transcriptomic for knowing the functional gene regulated for example, the trees resistant to like adapted to the flood or the drought or something like that.
Perfect.
Before we do
Perfect.
Genetics engineering, we
Perfect.
can do that approach first.
Wonderful. Okay, so that's where we can do experiments in the field, plant these trees here, which ones are the best. We can do lab experiments where we're trying to create more resilient trees. In the past, I know some of the mangrove areas are being transitioned for right or for wrong into aquaculture initiatives. And I've done work on communities doing aquaculture where they're using genetic modification to make the fish be bigger, grow faster, get them to market faster. They call them Frankenfish, like Frankenstein fish. And so salmon is a fish in Canada that is very popular. And they've created a genetically modified species that instead of 3 years to get to market, it's 2 years. So the farmers can make a lot more money, or somebody does. And I pay a lot more money for the fish. Okay, so field and lab experiments. In the lab, we control the research environment. It's easier to randomly assign research participants and or trees, easier to replicate, but it's weak external validity. What does that mean? It means just because it worked in the lab on the 4th floor of the building in my department, in my university in Canada, does not mean it's going to work in the field in a rural community in Indonesia. So even though we create it in a lab, we still have to test it in the field. So these are the key concepts that are relevant to experiments. So if you're thinking of doing an experiment, you got to tick all these boxes, right? The experimental or the treatment group receives a treatment or manipulation of some kind. Control group does not, because to have a good experiment, you have to have an exposure group and a control group. Random assignment has to be statistically random if you're going to be able to generalize from your experiment. Participants are placed in the experimental or control group using a random method. Pre-test, measure at the beginning. Post-test, measure at the end. So you've got a before and after. Causality underpins all of this. Remember, I know cause and effect. If I drop this law of gravity, it's going to fall on the ground 100% of the time. Cause and effect. Whenever we start to involve human beings, we have to back off that language of cause and effect. We can talk about things being more likely. And in fact, in much of the quantitative research that I do, the analytical method I use, where's my mathematician? I'm boring her. I do logistic regression analysis, and that tells me the odds, just like gambling, which I never ever do because I don't like gambling. But what are the odds of this person feeling this way under these terms and conditions? I can't say this caused this, but I could say under these terms and conditions, this person is X times more likely to report being anxious or report being worried about this environmental exposure. And we often express this in the language of variables, right? They're the characteristics or the attributes of the data that vary or change, that we have control over. Gender, age, tree species, soil salinity, interest in a subject, beliefs, those variables. All right, I'm going to talk for 2 more minutes and then we're going to quit for tea. This is a lot. Okay, independent variables we manipulate to see if they have an impact on the dependent variables. The way that I always remember this from undergraduate, independent or the dependent depends on the independent. So your dependent is your outcome variable. Perceptions, levels of trust, commitment to the environment, sustainability, soil salinity. So dependent is the outcome. So say sustainability of a mangrove protected area. Independent is the manipulated variable, like reduction of mangrove cutting, reduction of human interactions with the area. Those are the things we control to see if we impact the outcome. In a classic experimental design, independent and dependent variables are identified. Dependent variables observed or measured. We do a pretest. We did that on you. We had you fill out a survey at the beginning to see what your level of knowledge was. Then we're going to do a post-test at the end of the day. And then the treatment group receives the treatment while the control group is left alone. So if we're in the lab and we're trying to create genetically modified mangrove trees that are more resistant to, for example, water through flooding, we take this group of trees over here, we do stuff to them, take this group of trees over here, leave them alone. And at the end, we compare what happened. Right, that's what I just said. And then we write down anything that changed. And that's just basically what it looks like. So I want to talk about validity. Because if you want to collect good data to have impact and maybe get your research published, you need good data. Validity is just a way of saying good data. Do you have good data? Yep. Prove it to me. How did you assess whether or not you had good data? Because if you don't have good data, you can't draw conclusions. Your conclusions won't hold up. And if you can't draw conclusions, then what's the point of doing research? We talk about internal validity and external validity. We hinted at external validity a few minutes ago when we talked about scientific experiments that happen in a lab. Just because it works in the lab does not mean that it's going to work in real life. External validity. Will it work in real life? One of the phrases we use in my world quite often is related to the health impacts of stuff, right? So one day you read in social media, oh, don't drink coffee anymore. It's bad for you. It's going to give you cancer. And the next day you read, oh, coffee's good for you. It keeps your brain alert and you're not going to get dementia or, Alzheimer's disease. And the next day you read, oh, please don't drink coffee anymore. It's going to kill you. And it's like, come on. When those studies are done about the things that harm our health, especially when new drugs are developed, right? When they were developing new vaccines for COVID-19 and trying to understand what COVID-19 was, we'd never seen it before. They work on little rodents in the lab, right? Mice, rats. And they do things to the mice and the rats. You can't draw conclusions from the mice and the rats to human beings in the real world. It doesn't have external validity. It has to go through several more stages after that, right? And remember, we all became expert epidemiologists during COVID-19. When we were reading about who's got a vaccine, how come we don't have a vaccine? Who's at stage 1? Who's at stage 2? Who's at stage 3? Because once you got the rats under control, then you got to try it in the people. Thank you. So internal validity is concerned with the issue of whether causation has been established by a particular study. For example, did the study establish that education levels influenced attitudes towards environmental sustainability? Did you do that? Yes or no? In terms of experiments, when we're trying to establish internal validity, we look at history. So some event occurring after the treatment was given may have influenced the dependent variable, may have influenced the outcome. This happens in all research. So for example, you're doing a whole bunch of surveys in 3 communities where there's mangrove restoration going on, and all of a sudden in one of them, there's a flood halfway through your data collection. Now what do? It's messed up your whole study. Testing. The pre-test may have influenced the dependent variable. We gave you a survey on the first, or before the first day, but on the first day. Tell us about your background in terms of research. So, and that's information that's useful to us. So we know how to pitch. We know, what we need to talk about, what we don't need to talk about. Maybe you lied to us. How do I don't know you. You don't know me. How do I know you told the truth? And they were anonymous surveys, but we're basing our course on what you told us, right? This is the applied part of the data that you gave us. You may have also been influenced by that process. So, for example, you filled out that survey while we were in the room. You may have given different answers if you filled it out the night before when you were at home in your kitchen with a cup of tea or coffee. Instrumentation. Changes in the way a test is administered may account for pre-test and post-test differences. So, for example, we might have done an online version of the pre-test and then done a physical pen and paper one for the post-test. And we would get different data. That's why we never change our data collection strategy halfway through. We don't all of a sudden go from doing surveys over the phone to doing them in person because they're different. You'll get different data. Measurement validity or construct validity involves the question, are you measuring what you want to measure? So, for example, there is this concept called eco-anxiety. Has anybody ever heard of eco-anxiety? In the literature, we see this concept talked about particularly in our youth, our young people. Has anybody ever heard of Greta Thunberg? Greta Thunberg? She started doing climate strikes at her school when she was 9 years old. She's in Iceland. She's now spoken to the UN and everything. Yeah, yeah. Now we know who she is. That's eco-anxiety. That's a young child saying, you, Mr. President of the United States and Prime Minister of England, you are ruining my life. And I'm so worried about this that I'm going to give up something really valuable to me. I'm going to give up my education and I'm going to get other people to do it too. Eco-anxiety. I'm worried about the future of my physical environment. How do we measure that? GHQ-12, I was talking to some ladies yesterday. GHQ-12 is a 12-item measure of emotional distress. How do I know if it measures eco-anxiety? I'm not sure. But if I find another example in the literature of measuring that, then maybe I can say I've got construct validity. I know the questions that I'm asking are measuring the construct I'm interested in. I know the questions that I'm asking are measuring stress. I know the questions that I'm asking are measuring inequity. I know the questions that I'm asking are measuring gender balance or benefits or vulnerability. Are the questions that I'm asking actually measuring what I'm expecting them to answer? External validity. We've already talked about this. Are the findings applicable to situations outside the research environment? We have this phrase that we use sometimes, which is adult rats are not human children. So just because a vaccine works in an adult rat doesn't mean it's going to work in a human child. Can the findings be generalized beyond the people or the cases studied? So in previous times in history, a lot of drugs, when they were being developed, were being tested on vulnerable populations in sub-Saharan Africa without their knowledge. Big ethical issue. Shouldn't have done that. But these big drug companies were testing contraceptives, for example, injectable contraceptives in women in sub-Saharan Africa without their knowledge. But just because they work on women in sub-Saharan Africa, does that mean they're going to work on women all over the world? So again, some things to look out for, some threats to this. When we're doing those random samples, do we actually have representative study participants? The effects of the setting. Findings may not apply to settings and environments that differ from those of where the experiment took place. So if we're doing mangrove tree experiments in a mangrove restoration area, again, making things up in a certain coastal area of Indonesia, does that mean they will apply to another coastal area? And these are not right or wrong answers, things to think about, threats to our external validity. Again, history effects, if something happens in the middle, effects of our pre-testing, reactive effects of experimental arrangements. Findings might be invalid because they were caused by subjects behaving atypically due to the fact that they were in an experiment. So this has been documented over and over again. If Brent and Bill go into a community, especially those guys, because they don't look like people from Indonesia, go into a community and say, we're here to study your commitment to environmental sustainability. That's why we're here. And we're going to ask you a bunch of questions, and we're going to live in your community for 3 months. We're going to bring a whole bunch of graduate students from the University of Waterloo in Canada who've never left the country before. And we're going to watch you and see what you do. We're going to ask you about your commitment to environmental sustainability, and we're also going to observe you to see if what you're telling us is true. Do you think people are going to act normal? They're not going to act normal. And somehow you have to control for that. How are you going to control for that? That's tough. Replicability, often called reliability. So results remain the same when others repeat all or part of the study. So especially when we're using the nomothetic method and we're doing lab-based experiments, a really important part of the validity of that work is whether or not our wonderful forestry researcher can hand her protocol to a colleague and say, this is what I did. You follow the same things that I did and see if you come to the same conclusion. If that happens, that's external validity. Harder to do in field work, harder to do in situations that involve human beings, because human beings don't always act the same all the time. So in a lab experiment, of course, we have greater control over the environment, and that's a great asset. If the more control the researcher has, the more internal and potentially external or potentially internal validity. It's easier to assign participants randomly to conditions. And there are some limitations as well. You have lower external validity. Life doesn't occur in a test tube, right? So if we learn something in the lab, we have to make sure it also works in the real world. So those are experiments, but we can also do quasi-experiments. And as people who are working with human beings in these natural ecosystems, this comes in really handy. So we don't have as much internal validity because we don't have as much control as researchers. But we can, for example, think about a situation where we want to understand commitment to mangrove restoration in 3 communities. In the first community, we are going to establish a local women's group. And they're going to help us understand what the commitment is in that community. In the second community, we're going to create a youth group, because they're all full of eco-anxiety. They're watching Greta Thunberg on the social media, on the TikTok and all that kind of stuff. And now they're all worked up about the environment. We're going to get the youth involved. In the third one, we're just going to go in and ask questions and see what happens and do some surveys, but no intervention. And then see what the outcomes are in each of those communities. They could be different. So yeah, there's no causation here. It's just association. So we can do experiments. We can do quasi experiments. We can also do a cross-sectional design. I'm going to suggest that a lot of people who are going to do field work or community work are going to do a cross-sectional design because we only have 12 months. There's no before and after. And we're basically taking observations at one point in time. So we're measuring exposure and outcome. We're measuring independent and dependent variables at one point in time. And you can think of it like taking a photograph. You've got a photograph of one point in time. You don't know what happened before that photograph was taken. You don't know what happened after that photograph was taken. We're not manipulating an independent variable. There's no treatment. There's no intervention. There's no creation of a women's group. There's no creation of a youth group. And examples here are just, doing questionnaires or surveys, structured interviews, or observation. You just go in and observe. So you're measuring independent and dependent variables at the same time. You may have correlations that are statistically significant. So education is statistically significantly associated with commitment to restoration of mangroves in this community at this time. But that doesn't mean education caused that. Correlation does not equal causation. Gives us a good snapshot of one point in time. We do have issues with internal validity because we can't say this caused this. One point in time, there's no temporal component to that. So for example, a researcher might find a positive association between education and resilience to climate change, but does resilience influence education or is it the other way around? Or is there reciprocal? Is there a reciprocal relationship? Education influences resilience. Because I'm educated, I understand. And because I'm educated, I can advocate for myself, for my family, for my community. And I know the importance of education, so my resilience allows me to advocate for more amenities in my community. I can advocate for more education. Regardless, we don't know because we've just collected data at one point in time. Can also be problems with external validity. Once we've collected all these data in this one community at this one time, we can't really generalize to any other communities or any other time periods. Especially if we don't have a random sample. It is a nice way of taking a photograph of what's happening in real time with real people. And we can examine the effect of these variables that can't be manipulated in experiments. We can understand the impact of gender. We can understand the impact of age, ethnicity, culture, poverty, socioeconomic status, those kinds of things. Longitudinal designs, we are not going to do. We got 12 months, so we can't do a longitudinal design, but we could set ourselves up for a longitudinal design. And we can write a proposal that says, I'm going to do this in this proposal. And then in the final paragraph, we say, and these data can serve as a baseline for following up, say 5 years from now, after I do an intervention. So this allows us to add a temporal component to our research questions and understand in the relationship between independent and dependent variables, which ones come first. So for example, if an increase in resilience is observed at time 1 and an increase in well-being at time 2, that's evidence that the increase in well-being was preceded by the increase in resilience rather than the other way around. And we know that resilience is equivalent to having, you feel more self-control, and that's related to well-being. But we could never do that in a cross-sectional. But if you went into communities and measured resilience and well-being and all the other variables that affect those things, age, gender, and so on, you could go back 5 years later after maybe there's been an intervention in that community and see if you've actually changed that relationship. There's two basic types. One is, I'm going to start with the second one, actually, a cohort study. So you find a group of people in a community, you collect a bunch of data from them, and then maybe there's an intervention like, a mangrove restoration initiative. Then you go back 5 years later, 3 years later, and you measure those same things again. That's called a cohort study. You've built a cohort, like the cohort of researchers in this room. A panel study is doing the same thing, but with different people. So you might go into a community in year 1, you interview 500 people, and then you do your intervention, you do a mangrove restoration initiative, and then you go back 3 years later, 5 years later, and you interview another 500 people, but they're not the same people. That's a panel. And which one you choose is very much dependent on your research question. The drawbacks to doing that: attrition over time. So during that 3-year period, 5-year period, people move away, they might pass away. So different drawbacks to doing that, but we don't really need to worry about that right now because I really don't think anyone's going to do anything longitudinal. I think final one I'm going to talk about is case study design. And I've heard that language used in some people's proposals that they're talking about. And that's like, we're going to do a case study. We're going to go into this community and we're going to study this problem of mangrove restoration. And we might use a variety of methods. We might use some surveys. We might use some observation. We might use some interviews. But it's all going to happen in this one little place. Because it's a very intensive, in-depth analysis of this one place, external validity is an issue. You can't really generalize from this one place, this one community, to a whole bunch of other communities. You may be able to transfer some of your learnings, but not generalize. They do have other strengths, though. They give us a really in-depth, intensive understanding of what's happening that can inform future research. One of the things too, I just want to correct myself, usually it's like one place that you're studying. Harkening back to my PhD dissertation, I did what was called a parallel case study design, which was 3 separate case studies that were very different from each other. So I couldn't call it a comparative analysis, but I did 3 different case studies to understand 3 areas in depth. And I could take the learnings from each to inform them, but I couldn't call it a comparative study because I did not select them that way. Yeah, it's usually a single case, and the single case can be a person, a family, an organization, an event, a community, a mangrove protected area, and can involve a number of different research methods. But, in this context, for example, you could do a case study of, let me just ask so I get the right name. What is the name of the ministry in the government who oversees mangroves restoration? Is there a Ministry of Environment or, yeah, there's a Ministry of Environment, right? Okay. You could do a case study of the Ministry of Environment because they're the ones who are making all the rules. So how are they making the rules, and are they doing a good job? And how would you do that case study? You could use a number of different methods, including quantitative methods. Over time, how many mangrove protected areas have they established? What's their budget been? Has their budget increased over time, indicating that this is a priority? Has their staff increased over time, indicating that this is a priority? You can study their policy documents, as we talked about previously. We can study their policy documents using, we can scan them and we can do a content analysis of their policy documents. Where does mangrove restoration sit relative to other environmental priorities? Then you could also, if they said yes, interview people who work in the Ministry of Environment and see really how committed they are to mangrove restoration. So you can actually do a case study of an organization. So you can do, these are just types of cases. You can do a critical case. For example, studying a mangrove protected area for which certain planting techniques are successful. So finding that case where, wow, somebody did something really cool over there and it worked really well. Let's go figure out how and why. An extreme or unique case, for example, a particular mangrove protected area in a very active community. And I was thinking about this in the context of this example. We heard yesterday some discussion about protected areas being only those ones mandated by the ministry, but then there are other communities that are taking things into their own hands and saying, no, we need to protect our mangrove area in our community. This is our community and we're going to take a stand. That could be a really unique case. Let's go see what's happening there and how can we harness that to apply to other communities. A case that's never been studied before. For example, you hear about a particular mangrove protected area that seems to be doing really well. No researcher has ever gone there before to discuss, like, how's it going? How did you do that? Yesterday and the day before, we made you do all the work. So I'm going to talk just for a little bit more, and then we're going to put you to work. There's a lot of information in these slides that you can refer back to if and when you need to. You will get copies of all of the slides. What I have done for this presentation is actually go in and hide some of the slides. Do you know how to do that in PowerPoint? Where you just, so when you get the copies, they'll all be there. But it's way too much to give you in a short period of time. So I'm just going to go through this. So a lot of people want to do surveys or questionnaires. So we're going to just look at some kind of do's and don'ts and some best practices. So one of the first decisions that you make when you're designing a question for a questionnaire, is it going to be open-ended or closed-ended? So we talked about, for example, let's do an easy one. Education. You want to know the level of education of your respondent. So you could say a question, what's the highest level of education you've completed? And then they fill it in. They write it down. Or you can say, what's the highest level of education you've completed? And you have primary school, middle school, high school, college, university, and they just tick a box. The first one is open-ended. The second one is closed-ended. When I showed you the picture of the questionnaire earlier, most of that is closed-ended. But if it's closed-ended, we need to know what the answers are before we start. We need to give them a very short list, a complete list of the answers. So for example, just to be silly, if you had to answer a question, which was, what's your favorite color? And the answers would be red, yellow, blue, purple, green, because those are all the colors. You know what they are. There are sometimes you don't know what the things are. For example, we administered 1,000 surveys to women living in rural Kenya to find out how their lives were impacted by COVID-19. Most of the questions were closed-ended, ticking boxes, filling in spaces. One question we asked, however, was, over the past 12 months, what was the greatest issue facing your family? What was the greatest issue facing your community? What was the greatest issue facing your country? And that would tell us how important COVID-19 was to them relative to other things like water security or food security. We didn't want to put them in a box. We wanted them to tell us. The difference is, however, the boxes that you tick, especially when you do things, you probably do this here. When you do surveys or questionnaires with people, it's on a tablet or something like that, where they're actually inputting the data electronically. That works really well. And it goes right into your Excel spreadsheet or your SPSS or your SAS or your Stata. But when you have to take all of the 1,000 written answers, then you have to code them and organize them. So it creates more work for you. So it has to be really important if you're going to have an open-ended question. It has to be really worth your time and effort. So advantages of open-ended questions: allows for replies that the researcher might not have contemplated. So I always design, when I even design a closed-ended question, there's always an other category. So what's the highest level of education you've completed, all the categories, and then other, just in case, you never know. And then you say specify, and they write it in. I don't go to the trouble of coding those open-ended responses unless they are 10% or more of my sample. If I'm interviewing 1,000 people and I get 100 responses on a question that's an other category, the first sign to me is I made a mistake. I forgot something. I didn't design a good question. Open-ended questions also allow participants to tell you what they're really thinking. So I could have designed a question that said, because I've worked in Kenya for over 20 years. I could have designed a question that said, what's the number one issue facing your family over the last 12 months? And I could have said water security, food security, illness, death, eviction, which is a big problem, people getting thrown out of their houses. I could have done that and had it all completely just tick a box. But I would not have heard corruption. And that was a big problem at the community level in Kenya over the past 12 months. Corruption. Who controlled access to the things I needed to prevent COVID-19? How could I get masks? How could I get hand sanitizer? How could I get the vaccine when it came? There was a lot of corruption in that healthcare system. I never would have picked that up had I not allowed people to tell me their answers. Okay. Disadvantages: much more time consuming. You have to code the answers, less convenient for your respondents. You have too many open-ended responses. They get tired. They stop filling out your survey. And then if you're actually having an interviewer ask the question and write it down, interviewers might be different. I might write something different than if my colleague was interviewing the person next door. Advantages: minimizing interviewer variability and interviewer variability. So interviewer variability. So if I'm doing 1,000 surveys, I don't have one person asking all the questions. I had 10 community health workers going out into the communities and asking the questions. So each of them did 100 households. We needed to train them in advance to ask the questions all the same way, so that we don't have people asking them in different ways, because then we get different answers. Closed-ended questions are easier to answer because you just tick a box. They can answer it quickly and easily, and that reduces response rate issues. So if I can, move through your questionnaire really quickly, I'm probably going to finish. And again, if you're using an electronic tablet to collect the data, which is what we do, so our interviewers have tablets, and we actually use, I never thought about this. Could you write this word on the flip chart for me? We use a data collection tool, which is free, and it was designed by the UN for use in by humanitarian organizations. It's very, very good. And it's called Kobo Toolbox. Kobo all one word, but it's KOBO and then toolbox. So if you're looking for a survey tool, if you want to put your questions into a survey tool, you have them on a tablet, you have your interviewer standing there saying, okay, tell me, how long have you lived in this community? They put the answer in. How many children live in your household? You put the answer in. And by the end, the data are just uploaded right into SPSS or SAS or Stata or whatever data analysis package that you're using. It's free. It's incredibly good. We've used it in countries all over the world. Some prominent sources of error in survey research are just things to think about when you're designing your questions. They're poorly worded questions. One of the ways they're poorly worded, asking two things in the same question. If you say, you can tell my jet lag is kicking in. I'm getting tired. Okay. How far do you bicycle to work every day? That's asking two things in one question. One, do you ride a bicycle every day? And two, how far away from work are you? So don't do that. Not training your interviewers well, so they're not all asking the questions in the same way all the time. If there's a misunderstanding on the part of the interviewee, the person you're interviewing, and they say, well, what does that question mean? You have to train your interviewers to answer that question all the same way all the time. Interviewers might actually record information wrong. For example, in our Kenyan survey, the range of ages we had was from 16, which was the youngest age that we interviewed, to 2012. Nobody's 2012 years old. Why would that happen? It was a mistake in the data and we had to go back and fix it. Mistakes in entering the data into a computer file. So if you actually, have a questionnaire with a pen and a piece of paper and you're writing things down and then you have to give them to a technician or a research assistant to then enter them into your Excel or SPSS, it introduces human bias. And we talked about this, biases related to the characteristics of the person asking the questions, right? So women will tell women things that they won't tell men. You want people asking the questions who look like the respondents that you're talking to. Closed questions. You don't give the respondents any opportunity to tell you what they really think. Maybe that's okay. It depends very much on the research question. They also may not find a fixed response, that point number 3, that applies to them. So I always, always, always have an other category. And I always, always, always on these scales, if somebody says, for the following statements, tell me if you strongly agree, somewhat agree, disagree, strongly disagree. I will always, 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 always have a category that says don't know. Because sometimes people just don't know and they can't be forced into a response. And I'd rather have them say I don't know than just leave it blank, because that creates a problem when I'm analyzing the data. And I also always, always, always have a column that says refused. I refuse to answer this question. In our Kenyan data, for example, we asked, how satisfied are you? Well, let's go to Uganda. Uganda, as a country, has a president named Museveni. He's 82 years old and he's been president for 45 years. Every time someone tries to oppose him, he gets them picked up by the police, tortures them, throws them in jail, and then they say, okay, I won't oppose the president anymore. So he's been president that long, and that is why. So when we ask a question, how satisfied are you with the Ugandan government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic? To people who live in Uganda, that's a loaded question, and they might want to refuse to answer, and you need to give them the right to do that. But if they don't have that option, then you don't know what they really think. If they don't know, let them tell you they don't know. If they refuse to answer, let them tell you they refuse to answer, because those are data and we don't want to lose that. So that's why we always have an other category, a don't know category, a refused category. Types of questions, of course, is very basic and straightforward. Personal, factual questions. What's your age, occupation? Factual questions about others. How do you feel about living in this community? Factual questions about an entity or event, a political demonstration, or how do you feel about mangrove restoration? Questions about attitudes are very common in questionnaires and surveys. And we use these, we call them Likert scales, right? 5 points. How strongly do you agree or disagree? How likely do you think it is that you will take part in an alternative livelihood if one was offered to you? Very likely, somewhat likely, so on and so on. Questions about beliefs, questions about knowledge. And we can use that to test respondents' knowledge about climate change, for example, or about mangrove restoration. When you're designing questions, keep your research question in mind. It always has to come back to your research question. Make sure you focus on exactly what you want to know. And I always say, put yourself in the position of the respondent. Give the survey to yourself. How would you feel about answering these questions? So, for example, when people ask me questions about how much is my income, I tell them, because my income, because I work for a public institution in my country, a university, my income is public knowledge. It's published on the web. But if you ask me how many children I have and how old are they and are they boys or girls, I will not tell you. I don't want you to know that I have, 2 little girls living in my house and they're 12 and 14 and what their names are. No, 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 no. I'm not going to tell you that. So think about how you would feel when somebody's going to ask you those questions. Okay, we talked about that, and you're going to get these slides. I know I'm going fast because I don't want to talk for too much, and you're going to get all of this. Question order is important. Number 1, every participant should answer the questions in the same order. The very first questions they should get should be related to your research topic. So if you say, I would like to ask you some questions about mangrove restoration and how you feel about that in your community. The first question should not be, when was the last time you had a party? Doesn't make any sense. Your first question should be, how far away do you live from the mangrove? How often do you visit the mangrove site? Something like that, something directly related to the question. There may be sensitive questions, and this depends on your respondent and the situation. In this situation, for example, if you're interviewing someone who might be involved in illegal activity around mangrove cutting, you don't start with those questions, you put them at the end, because you hope by that time you've created a relationship with that person and they'll continue to answer your questions. Avoid provoking a response set. What does this mean? It means if we say, I'm going to read out a list of statements now, 20 statements, and I want you to tell me for each one, do you agree, disagree, somewhat agree, strongly agree, somewhat agree, strongly disagree, or disagree. You got 5, whoop, almost did it again, but I caught it. You got 5 points and you got to choose one. If all your statements are in the same direction, they will get in what's called a response set bias. They'll always choose the same answer all the way down. So you got to mix it up a bit. Good enough. Always, always, always run a pilot study. Test it out on your family, on your friends, on your students, on your coworkers. My biggest challenge in designing surveys is I want to ask everything, and my surveys are way too long. So I need to practice on somebody like my graduate students. Say, fill out this survey for me. Pretend you're a person of this set of characteristics. Fill out this survey for me. And they come back and say, that took 55 minutes to fill out that survey. That's way too long. If you're doing a survey or a questionnaire, you're at 20 minutes, 30 minutes tops if they really care. And my biggest challenge is always they come back and say, it's 55 minutes long and I got to cut so much stuff out of there. And I'm going to teach you a trick for that in a minute. Yeah, so practice, 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 pilot, train your interviewers well. Using existing questions. So you know how to go to the literature. Is there someone else who has surveyed a community around mangrove restoration that has a questionnaire that you can use? A lot of times people do not put copies of their questionnaires in their papers. Or they might have them as supplementary materials to their research papers in a journal. Or they will say, a copy of the data collection tool is available upon request. That's not because they want to charge you money. It's not because they're being proprietary. When we design surveys, we want other people to use them and tell us if they're good or bad. But what it does is it allows them to track that their survey is being used in another country, another community, another population. So you can ask, can I get a copy of your survey? And they will send it to you. One of the things I always do is look for other places that have asked similar questions so I can ask them in the same way so I can compare them. Demographic questions, for example. Levels of education is a good example of that. Or age categories, good example of that. Is there a national census in Indonesia? Do you do a national population census? Yeah. So we do a national population census. I go to the organization which is called Statistics Canada, and I say, what age categories do you use, Statistics Canada? What education categories do you use? What income categories do you use? And I use the same ones. So that when I have my sample, I can say my sample is representative of the Canadian population because I have the same distribution of age or gender or income or education. When you're measuring things in a scale like GHQ-20, I talked about that earlier. That's the general health questionnaire that measures emotional distress. Or there's a well-being, so you want to measure well-being, I've got a 7-point well-being scale. You want to measure water security, HWISE, the household water insecurity, something, something. International survey, it's 8 items, it's an index. Been used all over the world. There's also one for food security. You have to cite the original source when you use those, but it allows you to compare. You can modify the questions to suit. So for example, the general health questionnaire, the first time I used it in sub-Saharan Africa, some of the questions were not culturally appropriate. So I had to change the wording a little bit. As soon as you do that, you can't compare your scale anymore. But I've used it enough now in sub-Saharan Africa that I can compare it inside. So questionnaires are the same thing as, surveys, or this language is just, somebody administers the survey for you, or you just hand it to somebody and they fill it out themselves. They read the questions, they respond. This is how we do a lot of this now because people send them through email or put them on a web or something like that. And people fill out the questionnaires themselves. The challenge here is you have to have many fewer open-ended questions because they have to be fast. They have to be simple. They have to be short. Because if people get discouraged and don't complete, if it's 55 minutes long and you lied and said, no, it's only going to be 5 minutes for you to fill out this survey, and then they stop, you don't have good data. So you have to be really clear, and you also have to be really, really clear about how the questions are worded and make sure people understand them, because there's nobody there to clarify it for them. So advantages of questionnaires: cheaper, quicker, more convenient to administer. No interviewer effects. I'm not going to bias the information at all. And social desirability bias seems to be reduced. So if we ask more sensitive questions like, how often do you take alcohol? How often do you smoke cigarettes? If I ask you that to your face, you are likely to lie to me. But if I ask you in a web-based survey, for some reason, you're going to tell me the truth because you don't see me. Lots of disadvantages. I can't explain the question if you don't understand it. It's difficult to ask a lot of questions because the questionnaires have to be so short. But there's a time and a place for everything, right? So everything relates back to the research questions. So this is just about how to design them. And that's the end of questionnaires. There's a lot more in there in the hidden slides. And so you can look in there and get lots and lots of information. There's a way we can cheat this whole system, though, and that's by doing secondary analysis of survey data. There's lots of surveys that are done for with somebody else's money for another purpose that can access those data and use those data. The census is one, right? Can you get access to census data to analyze them? Yeah, analyze census data. Costs you nothing. Are there other national surveys done in Indonesia, like a health survey? Yeah. Go and get somebody else's data. There's some challenges because those data were not collected for your purpose, but you can use other people's data. Lots of advantages to that. It's cheap. It's good data. Your census data is going to be good data. You can do longitudinal analysis. You could look at, for example, I know we're really concerned about economic livelihoods in mangrove protected areas. Right. I'm making things up in my head, but I can imagine a situation where young people grow up in those communities. They don't have jobs there anymore because they're not able to cut the mangrove forest. So they move away from the community. And so we could look at census data over time. We could actually do a longitudinal analysis of the demographic profile of the communities around mangrove protected areas. Are the young people moving away because there's no jobs there? And that has a lot of implications for your community structure, right? Young people move away. Who's going to look after people like me as I get older? You can do subgroup analysis, reanalysis for new interpretations. It's amazing what you can do with secondary data. There are some disadvantages. These data were collected for some other reason, but lots of advantages as well. Phew. Okay. Any questions about that before I give you my last presentation before break, before you go to work? Which is about qualitative. Yes, we got two right there.
Hello. Yeah, oh, I got so loud. Sorry about that. So I was wondering about the number of respondent. Is it compulsory represent the total number of a population? Because considering the time limit, accessibility, and also their willingness to participate. Because some some reviewers, they gonna ask like, is it represent the total number of population and like that? So yeah.
That is what I'm going to talk about between 4 and 4:30 is how to draw a sample. So just give me a little time. I'm going to tell you exactly. I'm going to answer all those questions.
Okay, thank you.
Philip has a question.
Okay, thank you. Based on your experience, I just want to clarify, do we use like 100% of actual data that we get from the surveys or interviews, or is there any conditions that we can manipulate the data to, minimize some kind of errors and something like that?
No,
Okay.
you don't throw data out. That's called academic integrity. So you use the entire data set for sure. There are lots of ways, and I'm going to talk about that when I do populations and sampling. There are lots and lots of ways to address rigor and validity in how you collect the data, make sure it's good data. There's this word called outliers. So for example, in my example where I said our range of ages went from 16 to 2012. Well, we know that's not possible. We know it's an error. We could have just thrown that variable out, which is never a good thing to do. But we were lucky enough that our interviewers knew who they interviewed and they could go back and correct it. Yeah. I don't want to put everyone to sleep, so I'm just going to quickly. Oh, were there any questions on the Zoom? Ask me. No. Okay. I'm going to quickly go through qualitative so we can put you all to work. Yep. And again, I've hidden a number of these slides. Yeah. So I'll just go right. Qualitative research is concerned with words and images as opposed to numbers, right? We talked about that already. Life isn't seen as fixed. It's an outcome of interactions and negotiations. So my perceptions, my attitudes that I'm going to share with you are because of who I am and where I live. And we take a naturalist perspective. We don't want to change the world that we're in. We want to understand it. These are the different kinds of qualitative research. Ethnography or participant observation. Say you want to go live in a community surrounded by that's part of a mangrove protected area, and you want to observe. You want to see what people do. You can talk to people, and you can do it one-on-one. You can interview them, or you can have focus groups where you bring lots of people together. The decision that you make is based on your research question. Discourse or conversation analysis, you actually analyze the language that people use when they speak. An example would be you have a national parliament. You have a national parliament in Indonesia? Yeah. Are you allowed to go and watch the parliament as they're debating about things? Are people allowed to go watch? No. Do they record the national parliament conversations? No. Okay. I'm going to use a Canadian example then. In Canada, when Parliament is sitting and they're debating new laws and things, members of the public can go watch. Also, they record every word that is said and they publish it. And people can go and read that conversation about this minister saying we must do this, and this minister on the other side of the house, the other political party saying, oh, no, we mustn't do that. And you can analyze that language. It's called discourse analysis. I don't think our projects will be focused on that, but just for completeness. Content analysis, it's just qualitative analysis of texts and documents. We talked about policy documents and social media posts. Participatory action research is when you actually go into that community and say, I want to start a women's empowerment group around mangrove restoration. I'm going to be part of that group with you. So 5 main steps. Research question, got that already. Select a relevant site and not subjects, but research participants. So residents in a rural community, for example, living in close proximity to a mangrove protected area. Collect the data. Using one of those methods, interpret the data. So residents don't perceive climate change as a problem because there's enough fish to feed their family at the present time. Might be a take-home message. And then evaluate the data related to your research questions. So if the community does not perceive climate change to be a problem, how will you be able to address the need to build resilience to climate change or change behavior to address the impacts of climate change? Okay. Qualitative research is often criticized because sample sizes are very small and the data are not numbers. So we figure out a way to do qualitative research in a very systematic and rigorous way, just like we would do any other type of research. And we assess it using a series of criteria. Credibility is the first of those criteria. So if you do interviews with someone, as Brent and Bill were saying, you do the interviews, you come up with some ideas, you go back to the community and you say, I asked you these questions. This is what you told me. Does this make sense to you? Checking in with the people who provided you with the information. And it's called member checking. Transferability. We know that the ultimate goal of quantitative research is generalizability. We can't do that in qualitative research because our sample sizes are small and we do not have random samples. But we talk about the transferability of our findings to other contexts or other people not studied, another community on the same coast, for example. Dependability. Were proper procedures followed? Did you have a clear protocol? Did you follow the protocol? Confirmability. Was the researcher objective and unbiased? Did the researcher sway the results in any way? One of the ways we can do this is by auditing or keeping a field journal, writing down every day what you've been doing. So the main goals of qualitative research, almost done, is seeing through the eyes of the research participants. So instead of numbers being the data, it's the voices. You privilege the voices of those who are impacted. So you're seeing through the eyes of those being studied. Okay, that's that. The critiques of qualitative research, as I just said, it's too subjective. I'm talking to you, I'm writing down your words. That's not data. That's not science. It is if we do it systematically and rigorously. Bias can result from personal relationships that develop during the research. If you decide you're going to move to a mangrove protected area community, for example, for 3 months and observe people, maybe you'll make friends. Maybe you will lose your objectivity. It's difficult to replicate. That's absolutely true. Replicability is not something we're trying to do as we would be doing in quantitative research. And we can't generalize. But we're not setting out to generalize. We're setting out to understand and build a strong understanding of a community. Lack of transparency. I don't agree with many of these. It may be difficult to determine how the research was conducted, why certain people were chosen for in-depth interviews, and so on. Unclear how researchers arrived at specific findings, and maybe the researchers didn't keep a detailed record of decisions taken at various stages of the research. If you are keen, could you write something down? Sorry. If you are keen to do qualitative research, there is actually lots of information, and there will be a lot in these slides about how to do it systematically and rigorously. But there is also a set of guidelines to follow to make sure it's systematic and rigorous. And those are the COREQ guidelines, COREQ. And it's a list of 37 things that you're supposed to do as a qualitative researcher. I've never done all 37 things. EQ. But some journals now, if you're submitting qualitative research, they want you to address the COREQ guidelines. So you can look those up or read these slides. It'll give you a sense of how to do qualitative research systematically and rigorously. And I always say I was trained as a quantitative researcher first, and then came to qualitative research when I realized there are some times when this is the appropriate methodology for my research question. But because I was trained as a quantitative researcher first, I think that makes me a very systematic and rigorous qualitative researcher, and I'm very committed to that. And this is the other piece of that. So in quantitative research, we don't analyze the data ourselves, right? Oh, actually, take that back. We do analyze the data ourselves, but we don't manage the data ourselves. We have 1,000 surveys. We don't sit down and read them all through and calculate things out by hand. We put them into SPSS or SAS or STATA or R, some statistical analysis software package. This is a qualitative analysis software package. It's been around for over 25 years. We actually use this to help us manage and analyze our data. This book is one of the best books on rigor in qualitative research, and it talks about credibility, dependability, confirmability, transferability, the things we just talked about. It's actually from 1985, and nothing better has been written since. And if you're not sure about any of these things and you want more information, this is a website that links you to Johns Hopkins University, where it says credibility. This is what it means. This is how you do it. Transferability. This is what it means. This is how to do it. So if you need more information or some steps to follow, you will find them at this website. The last thing I want to say in terms of the quality of stuff is reflexivity. And that's who you are affects the data that are collected. The end. So rather than saying, oh, it's biased, it's not objective, no science is objective. I get real pushback from students when I say that, but no science is objective. Your science that you're proposing to FINCAPES is not 100% objective. Why? Because you want the funding. So you're going to shape your research to the research call. That's not objective. So our qualitative research is also not objective. But we're very upfront about that. And we say, it's not objective. The end. I'm biased. So for example, in my work in Kenya, the first graduate student I sent to interview villagers, women, about their water issues, looked like me, very white, from Canada, long straight hair, which the little African children loved because they'd never seen anyone with straight hair before, and interviewed the women. She did really well because she was a woman interviewing other women. It didn't seem to matter that she was white and from another country. The next grad student who went in was from sub-Saharan Africa, but from Ghana, not Kenya, and he was male. And I always thought about who got the best data. So we just have to be upfront and recognize that whoever we are, we're influencing the data that we're getting. And this paper that's in the slides is a really, really good tool for understanding how you're going to impact the data that you're collecting and what you can do about that. And again, one of the best, there's five, they talk about 5 things that you can do. One of the best things is interview yourself. Interview yourself. How would you feel if you start asking questions about this? And I made, when I did qualitative training for my interviewers who were interviewing children in all of these countries about the physical violence that they experienced. These are countries where it's very, very, still very common. If a child misbehaves in school or is punished in school, it would be corporal punishment. They would be caned or something else like that. And I made all of my interviewers interview each other and then themselves. Because, you know, if you're a little child who's experienced this and you've got a gigantic man coming to interview you, how's that going to make you feel? And of course, the whole thing is we want good data. We want to do excellent science. So we control all of these things by doing this. So these are just the contrasts between quantitative and qualitative. And it's all dependent on your question. Yay, we're going to talk about sampling. So when we've got our research questions and our research methods, we got to figure out who we're going to talk to and how we're going to draw a sample. Thank you. Because we can't talk to everybody. So taking a sample is simply the process of choosing a smaller number from the population. Doesn't matter if you're choosing trees or social media posts or newspaper articles or policy documents or human beings. You can't do everybody. You got to choose a few. 2 main types of sampling, probability and non-probability. What's the difference? Random versus non-random. In a random sample, every single element has an equal chance of being chosen for the sample. In non-probability sampling, we don't use random selection methods. Typically in qualitative research, we use purposive sampling, convenience sampling, maximum variation. But if we do not use random probability sampling, we cannot generalize to the population. We can make inferences, we can transfer findings, but we cannot generalize according to the laws of inferential statistics unless we use a random sample. So, key terms we need to know. What's the element or unit of analysis? A unit of analysis can be a person, can be a household, can be a community, can be a country. You define what the unit of analysis is. A population is all the cases that a researcher is interested in. So I could have a population of policy documents. Every policy document written about mangrove restoration in Southeast Asia from 1950 to 2024. That's a population. A sampling frame is the list of elements that the sample will be selected from. So when I didn't actually collect the data, my research assistants collected the data from 1,000 women in Kenya. We wanted 1,000 women. So first we chose 10 neighborhoods. And for each neighborhood, we listed every household. And the community health workers who did the surveys randomly chose 100 within each neighborhood. So we had 1,000 women. So a sampling frame would be the list of all the policy documents, the list of the people who live in that community, And then the sample is the subset of that population that you've selected to work with. A representative sample is a sample that contains the same essential characteristics as the population. So if I wanted to survey a representative sample of the population of Indonesia, I would select my sample and then I would compare it to the census data to tell, is my sample representative of that population, yes or no? So a probability sample, I already said, random. Each element in the population has an equal chance of being selected. And then non-probability, we don't use random. Sampling error. It's the part that we're wrong, basically. You estimate the error that occurs because of the differences between the characteristics of the sample and those of the population. For example, I did a national survey in Canada about food allergies, people who are allergic to certain types of food. When I finished, I compared the characteristics of my sample to the characteristics of the Canadian population. And I made a big mistake. Several big mistakes, actually. I underrepresented low-income households. I underrepresented what we call new Canadians. So in Canada, we are a nation of immigrants. Very few Canadians who live there are actually having enough babies to replace the population. We take in a lot of immigrants. I underrepresented them. Both of those groups are the kinds of groups that don't respond to surveys. For our new Canadians, English is not a first language. We can only work in our two official languages, English and French. And low-income people are characteristically non-responsive to surveys. So I made a big error, but I can calculate that error and say, I'm right within a certain confidence interval. Non-response is when an element selected for the sample does not supply the required data, so they don't respond. That's why you need to make your questions really clear and your data collection tools really straightforward and not take a lot of time, or else people will just stop responding. And a census is data that comes from the whole population, just like your census, your national census. And there are times when we work in small communities. So if anyone's planning, for example, to work in a small rural community and there are only 100 households there, you might want to talk to everyone. So you don't draw a sample, you actually have a census. There's lots of sources of bias in our sampling. We introduce bias by not using a random method to pick the sample, but sometimes we do that purposefully because generalization is not our goal. The sampling frame. Sometimes human judgment might select one group over another. For example, sometimes when we interview in person, we were talking about this with one of the ecotourism projects. People coming to visit a site that's an ecotourism site. And you say to your interviewers, okay, as they're coming in, do a survey with them. But maybe there's an inherent bias. Maybe you have female supervisors and they're too timid to approach males coming. And non-responses, some people in the sample fail to participate and that skews your data. In my country, for example, we always want to represent our indigenous peoples, but they will not respond to surveys. they even do not respond to the census. So we have a very inaccurate count of our Indigenous population in Canada because they refuse to respond to the census. Okay. How can we go about doing a probability sample? We can do a simple random sample. You have a list of everyone who lives in the community, say it's 5,000 people, and you want to interview 500. You take the first one, and then you take every 10th person. Very simple. And it's very random. It works. I just said that. You can fill out this wonderful formula that will tell you how many people you need to talk to. You asked that question earlier. So this is just an example. The sampling ratio is the little n, which is the sample, over the big N, which is the population. So a sample size of n of 1,000 taken from a population n of 100,000. That way our sampling ratio is 0.1. It's not very big. We can do a systematic sample, which we talked about at that table over there. Selecting directly from your sampling frame without using random numbers, because that's the other thing you can do is just generate random numbers. Any way to do it randomly. Okay, we don't need problems. Stratified random sampling. Let's go back to my PhD. I wanted to talk to enough people for a robust analysis that lived within 2.5 kilometers of my site. So I drew concentric circles around my study site that were 500 meters each. And I continued to do that till I got enough sample in my circles. But I had a stratification in there because I had those who lived within 0.5 kilometer, 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometers, 2 kilometers, and 2.5 kilometers. It was stratified by distance because I wanted to know if people who lived closer were more concerned about their environmental exposure than people who lived far away. So I can stratify my sample that way. I just told you how to do that. And you'll get all these slides. Multi-stage cluster sampling. If you're going to do a very large population, when I redid my national survey in Canada, I went, oh, I made so many mistakes. I got to do it again. What we did was Canada's divided into 10 provinces and 3 territories. And then within each province, we took a random selection of the next administrative level down, which is called a census tract. So 10 provinces, each province has a certain number of census tracts, took a random selection of the census tracts, then took a random selection of households within each of the census tracts that were chosen. That's only when you have a really large sample. That's what I just described. And there are problems with that. Okay. We talked about sampling error because where's my actuarial science person? My actuarial science person knows all about calculating statistical power. When you have to figure out how big should my sample be in quantitative research, 2 ways to do it. One is statistical power, but that's only if you know the outcome that you're looking for. You see that a lot in clinical research. So if we wanted to do an evaluation, is this vaccine better than this vaccine? We calculate statistical power. How many people do we need in the sample to pick up at least a 5% difference between this vaccine and this vaccine in terms of effectiveness? And there's a formula, you plug your numbers in and you get a sample size. But when we don't know the outcome, like how many people agree or disagree with the need for mangrove restoration projects in Indonesia? We don't know. So we calculate what's called a sampling error. Right. The formula for that is not here, but it's all based on probability, right? So whenever we have data, we assume that they're normal. If this means nothing to you, don't even listen to me. This will all be in the slides and you probably don't need it. But if you do, you can Google it. All data should have a normal distribution, right? With a big hill in the middle and two tails on the sides. And according to the laws of inferential statistics, 95% of all your sample means will lie within 1.96 standard errors off the mean. What? What that means is about 2% on this tail and about 2% on this tail will be error. Everything else will be okay. That's where we get our 95% confidence interval from. And there's a way to calculate if I have a population this big and I have a sample size of this big, will I be within that 95%? And it will tell you yes or no, you will be within that 95%. And it will tell you how many times out of 20 you will be within that 95%. So you will be within that 95% 3 times or to within plus or minus 3%, 19 times out of 20. Basically, it's just a way of saying, yep, my sample size is enough. So you're writing those full proposals. If you need to say my sample size is going to be this and you need to justify it, that's a way to do it by calculating your standard error, sampling error if you're using a quantitative survey. You don't have to remember any of that. Einstein had a very, very bad memory because he would say, why should I have to remember my telephone if I can look it up somewhere else? Why should I remember how to calculate a sampling error when I can look it up somewhere else? So the larger your sample, the lower the error. But it's all about trade-offs. How much time do I have? How much money do I have? How many trained people do I have? But basically, every time you increase the sample size, it cuts the sampling error. That's all you need to do. Bigger the sample, better it is. But it's about trade-offs. So how much do you have to work with? Issues with sample size, the response rate's the percentage of the sample that participates in your study. The first time I did my national survey in Canada, my response rate was 35%. It's not very good. That means 65% said, nope, not responding to your survey, go away. That's not good. So I did all this research, but how do I get people to respond to my survey? And all the research went to the literature, found out all the research said, give them $5. So I did. And the next response rate was 59%. All for $5. How crazy is that? But it worked. And then if you have a low response rate, you have to think about, is there some common characteristic of the people who didn't respond? Because you know the characteristics of the people that you asked to respond. And if all the people who said no were women or poor people or immigrants, then your sample is really skewed and you can't do much with that. Heterogeneity of the population just means, are they different ages, sexes, ethnicities, religions, occupations, all very different, because the more they are internally different, the larger your sample size should be. In my villages in rural Kenya, everybody's poor. Everybody's of the same religion. Everybody is basically a subsistence farmer. everybody is married, has lots of kids. They're very, very similar. We would call that a homogeneous population. So I don't need as many people. But if I want to survey the whole country in Indonesia, my sample better be much bigger so I can capture all the different types of people. The sample size also that you get may depend on the analysis that you want to do. One aspect of that has to do with the different groups you might want to compare. So if you want to compare men and women, do you want to compare men and women with different levels of education? Do you want to compare men and women with different levels of education who have different occupations? Because the more you cut those data into different categories, the more people you need to make sure you have enough in those categories that you can do robust statistical analysis. The bottom line is you need 5 in each category, but that's the minimum. Okay, non-probability sampling. This is where we might be doing some qualitative stuff. Convenience sampling. These are just people that you know, so you just get them. It's not very systematic, not very rigorous, but it's a great way to get started. Snowball sampling. I'm now thinking this is really funny because this may mean absolutely nothing to you. My country has a lot of snow. I know that, especially as a child, we used to like to make little people out of the snow, right? Like snowmen. That's what you did when you were a kid. You made snowmen. And you'd take a little ball of snow and you would roll it and roll it and roll it, and all of a sudden it'd be a big ball. You make another one, you pile them on top of each other, you got a snowman. Snowball sampling means I don't know who I'm going to talk to, but I know one person who lives in this community. I'm going to start with them. So I interview them, and at the end I say, do you know anybody else I should talk to? And they say, well, here's a couple of people. And you go and talk to them. And I say, do you know anybody else I should talk to? They give you a couple of people, and so on and so on and so on. And it builds like a snowman. Quota sampling is we want to make sure we have this many women, this many men, this many seniors, this many people of high income, this many people of low income, so that we fill out a quota for each of them. That's all that means. It's not random, so you can't generalize. We already talked about that. Lots of sampling error. Okay. I think this is the last slide. Last slide on qualitative versus quantitative. So we know that quantitative is extensive versus intensive because of the time involved, and the sample sizes are very different. Got 1,000 women in Kenya. We also did qualitative interviews. We did 15. Very different sample sizes, but very different research questions. So how do we justify the size of our sample if we're doing qualitative work? Because typically our sample sizes are between 15 and 20. How do we justify them? There is this word that we use in qualitative research, which is saturation. We keep doing interviews until we reach saturation. What does that mean? It means no more new ideas are coming. But that depends on somebody trusting you as the researcher to say, okay, I'm not hearing anything new, so I'm done. That's pretty vague, especially when you're writing a research proposal that's going to be reviewed by other people. So you can say, I'm going to interview 15 to 20 people, and the actual number, the specific number, will be impacted by, the point at which I reach saturation. Then you reference this paper, because you always provide a reference. That's, the difference between tell me and show me. So this paper, we actually published in the journal of which I am the editor-in-chief, and it's a systematic review of sample size for saturation in qualitative research, right? So you say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it till I reach saturation. Reference. And that's embedded right in the slides that you'll get today. And I'm going to stop talking as soon as I say, is there anything I can clarify for you? Because our big boss just came in now. Yes, sir. Oh, do we need, hang on. I'm going to get my.
Uh, my question will be, for example, if we want to do a participatory approach, yeah, and how we how is the sampling in this regard? Because we we have engaged, for example, a particular group of people in the study area, and and the study will deal with these people. Should we sample?
How will you choose what people you're going to work with?
It's already there. They're already there.
Oh, so is it the whole village?
No,
Is it a group that
a
already
group of
exists?
people, a group of
Like
locals.
like a community-based organization that already
Yes,
exists?
yes.
Perfect. Yeah,
Mm.
then you're done.
So we don't have to sample.
No.
Okay.
Unless you think there's somebody missing from that group.
Oh, okay.
But if there's an already existing community-based organization and you're going to work with them,
Mhm.
then your work is already done.
Mm.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
We would invite Professor Dodik to officially close this short course, please. So I will invite Prof. Dodik. Please applause, everyone.
Ya, terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore Bapak Ibu semuanya. Biji selasih, bumbu ikan kakap. Terima kasih para peserta training FINCAPES. Ini termasuk agak susah, FINCAPES itu apa gitu ya. Termasuk kakap. Oke, baik. Bapak Ibu sekalian, sekali lagi terima kasih atas kehadiran dan partisipasinya. Semoga setelah training ini bisa segera disusun proposalnya. Tadi kalau proposalnya juga sudah mulai dibuka. Mungkin secara resmi beberapa waktu lagi nanti kita buka. Secara resmi mudah-mudahan nanti ada yang tertarik dan juga berkesempatan untuk melakukan riset bersama teman-teman FINCAPES. Insya Allah nanti juga ada training di Kanada ya, cuma kita belum tahu ini ya kapan. Mudah-mudahan nanti juga paling tidak beberapa bisa juga ikut partisipasi Bapak Ibu sekalian. Mungkin itu yang bisa kami sampaikan. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu sekalian semuanya. Sehat selalu. Semoga selamat kembali sampai tujuan di rumah masing-masing untuk yang di luar kota. Yang di dalam kota mungkin masih menikmati suasana kota Bogor, silakan. Baik, terima kasih. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.